Hey everyone, my name's Octavia. I'm a community specialist here at Prelude Security. For those of you that are watching for the first time, every week we host a special guest speaker to come in and talk about something InfoSec or InfoSec adjacent. In this case, tonight we have a very special guest. Alex Rudolph is joining us to talk about global affairs and threats intelligence as it relates to nation-state actors and cyber conflict. So this is going to be super interesting. I'll hand it over to you, Alex, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Octavia. Great to be here, as I normally don't get to talk to too many InfoSec audiences, so very happy to talk to an audience where I don't have to explain a lot of the just basic technical details to. So normally this is a presentation I give to other social scientists and those that work in policy. So I've tried to adapt it a little bit to be a bit more hands-on, or rather help walk through methods to understand how global affairs affects cyber conflict and how that influences the larger threat environment. So today we're going to go over a few things. First, a bit more about who I am, a little bit of the history of kind of how we got to thinking how cyber conflict works as it is now. Unfortunately, it's not that great, but we'll go into that. And then we'll be looking at Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a way to kind of walk through how we would understand prior to the invasion and going into it, and how to understand the general community and world and how they perceived the cyber components of the invasion at the start. So a bit more about me. I'm a PhD candidate at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Most of my work is in international relations, and also a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Most of my research is about how states actually achieve their wants and objectives in cyberspace. And how I tend to look at this, and is what we'll be going over today, is cyber force structures, or how countries or militaries build up their capacity to project force in cyberspace, and also doctrine about just why they do this in the first place. And kind of outside of that, a lot of what I do these days is specifically looking at Canadian cyber defense policy, which isn't much to that, but I might be one of the few actually doing it. All right, so different disclaimers. I am a social scientist, so that colors everything that I really do. And as much as I have a little bit of a technical background, that allows me to at least speak with yourselves and others actually working in this field. That just at least puts me a little bit ahead of most. But at the end of the day, at most, I would be described as a script kiddie. In addition to that, a lot of what I'll be discussing here is a proof of concept, where a lot of this is part of my PhD research, and I'm still working through a lot of this, so any comments are appreciated. All right, jumping in and looking at the initial aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were countless articles that were talking about there's no real cyber war and there's no real cyber component to the war. And plainly, that's just not true. As I know that many of you will be involved in, just aware of the massive amounts of malware going in and out of Ukraine, and specifically targeting Ukraine. This isn't just true. So what exactly explains this? And I blame these two here. Thomas Rid is a political scientist now out of Johns Hopkins University. And his obsession, in a way, of Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian general back in the early 1800s during the Napoleonic Wars, that had a few good things to say about war and very much embodies how kind of Western states view warfare. But the problem with this is that if you're applying the thoughts of a general from early 1800s to cyberspace, doesn't exactly hold up. So I'll go into why. So Thomas Rid uses Clausewitz, and Clausewitz says war is violent, instrumental, meaning that it's used to achieve a specific aim. And ultimately, what Clausewitz is most famous for is saying war is political, that no matter the general cause of war, there is a specific means and ends to it, a purpose for it to actually occur. And that kind of goes behind understanding that war is political. This isn't to say that all war kind of makes sense, but rather people will have a motivation and justification to uh, wage war in some manner. And so, taking these kind of tenets, Britt argues that cyber is ultimately not able to conduct or do physical violence. But as the years go on, we know this increasingly is not true. It may be rare, but not true. Cyber cannot achieve an end in war, which is kind of difficult to understand when the entire purpose of malware and cyber operations is to achieve a specific end for the operation. So it's a little odd, and tries to make the point that because cyber operations are secretive, it can't ultimately be political. And so, without spending too much time on all of those, it's easy to understand that they're inherently problematic and that you're applying these traditional notions of what war is on cyberspace and how states are using it. And so it doesn't quite hold up. But to put it in kind of a perspective, where RID sits is kind of in the middle of a bigger debate. So RID exists in this space that's sometimes called the golden age of cyber literature, where vast amounts of articles were written kind of motivated by RID, arguing that cyber war is not war and that really it's just all about intelligence and intelligence organizations going against each other. So this contrasts from the early 90s and 90s throughout, which kind of painted it as cyber war is coming, which was kind of the first major article written about states conducting operations in cyberspace to achieve some sort of end. And just as a side note, when I say states, this refers to as countries. It's a uh, for some Americans, it will be kind of confusing when looking at states as a subnational unit, but when referring to as states, it's referring to as to countries. And so it's in the 90s where there's this large characterization of states are developing these highly technical piece of malware and exploits, and it is going to wreak havoc on our systems. A common phrase that they would say is incoming cyber Pearl Harbor that I think even some people still use today. And so a lot of it was around the kind of scare tactics in a way, or just trying to build awareness of it as a core of what a lot of these early thinkers were doing was just trying to figure out what the hell this is. As we are thousands of years of conducting war, we've learned a few things here and there. We're barely on 30 years of one understanding how to achieve malicious aims in cyberspace, but also trying to figure out how to do that strategically. So what Rid did was he go from one end and he went completely the opposite to where there's a little bit of truth in both. But I would almost describe it as a way of we go from hackers all the way to black hat. That both of them are incorrect, but they each have a little bit of truth to them. But at the end, now there's not really much going on. That there are some efforts of trying to create some theories to explain cyber warfare, like cyber persistent, which is gaining a lot of traction. But a lot of people have kind of stepped away from the field to, which has almost de facto let Rid win that there isn't such a thing as cyber war. But this becomes a problem when go back to the news articles, people are saying there isn't a cyber war, that there is some kind of disconnect there, that people aren't exactly understanding this, and that this debate about if cyber warfare is war in the first place kind of negates and overlooks the whole purpose. And so, taking this ideas of what RID established, uh, we can look at if this is even true in the first place, looking at Ukraine. And so, even just a cursory look, we begin to see a lot of RID's arguments begin to not hold up. So, in the initial months of uh, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you see a lot of shaping events where getting prepared for the coming invasion. In January, you see a lot of intimidation tactics that they may not be Russia themselves saying that they're doing this, but it's specifically a uh, operations and malware and ransomware to intimidate and try to ensure Ukraine's capitulation once Russia invades. And a lot of this is very overt and causes physical damage, as in the case of, I think it was uh, Hermetic Wiper did had some uh, physical components to it. I can't remember which one it was, but by and large, a lot of these were also wipers that it may not be actual physical damage being done, but when you factor in that a lot of these attacks are wipers to destroy all data that exists. If we understand data to be one of the most valuable things these days, it's not that much of a jump to understand this as different forms of violence. And even kind of broadening this a bit to kind of look at how Russia is not necessarily conducting these operations as Western countries would. So kind of broadening it a little bit, we see that there's quite a bit going on, that not only are non-state actors jumping in on this with the Ukraine, uh, Ukrainian IT army, we have some ransomware groups even jumping into pick a side. So not only is a lot going on, but it's really complex and messy. And so this begins to inform uh, how to understand what is wrong with our usual understandings of cyber warfare or cyber conflict. A few of these arise from how RID understands these problems. And part of this derives from the thinking that cyber warfare and cyber conflict is operated similarly to traditional warfare, almost in a way that RID expects individuals to, or states to proclaim we are now at cyber war and line up their uh, deployables and saying this is when we're going to attack. Obviously, this is not what occurs, and that there are various unique dimensions to how states and APTs operate. And understanding kind of these inherent fallacies in RID's arguments allows us to kind of understand start of how to perceive cyber conflicts. So some of these fallacies are uh, that if a capability or exploit exists, that it will always be used. And as we've been finding, that a lot of the exploits used by Russian APTs have been there for quite a while, just sitting there waiting for a time. Now, this has had various mixed results, but this has also kind of arisen out of finding other exploits that haven't been used, that it's all about how they're actually used. And this kind of connects to the second one, which is that cyber warfare is highly technical in nature, when in reality, a lot of the uh, most successful attacks so far against Ukraine have been pretty basic. I wouldn't really say that wipers are too advanced when you get to like the basics of what they are. Uh, but the entire point of them is to erase that data and other means of knocking off a system or even intimidating them, as they did early in the war. So it's all about how it's done, not necessarily that what is going into uh, the operation itself. And ultimately, kind of as I mentioned, there is a major problem in the debate itself. That debating if cyber war exists in the first place or if it is war kind of overlooks the entire need to understand cyber conflict in the first place is to manage it. That if we're constantly debating about what is and isn't cyber warfare, it overlooks how states are actually conducting these operations and what they're doing to achieve their ends. And so that plays into what I'll be discussing a little bit later on. And part of this arises from how we begin to understand how cyber conflict is occurring. And although my focus here is on what Russia is doing in Ukraine, a lot of this is applying elsewhere. But Ukraine just offers a really good case study for this. And part of the reality is that tactics, techniques, and procedures is really based off of the individuals, how they learned to conduct these operations, and also the operation itself. And so this might seem circular, but think of it as when you initially learn how to deploy any sort of malware, you understand how to deploy that malware, and you think about uh, further actions around what you know how to do with that deployable malware. And that kind of frames future thinking. And that's where learning more procedures and other techniques is what ultimately builds you as an operator. So uh, thinking of uh, operations and cyber attacks in a linear fashion kind of overlooks the broad spectrum of humans themselves. As if we are not achieving success, I would be surprised if someone who isn't determined is just going to keep on trying the exact same thing rather than innovate. And I kind of mentioned this before in my next comment, which is the exploit that you use. It doesn't matter if it took millions of dollars to develop it or you just stumbled upon it accidentally. It's only how you use that exploit or vulnerability uh, to achieve your ends. A lot of discussion about lateral movement once you actually get in a system. That's kind of what all of this is about. That getting into a system is easy. Uh, Moving around and achieving something is much harder. And kind of encompassing a lot of what I'm talking about is that you can't plug and play cyber conflict and cyber attacks with existing doctrine. And so this is to say that you can't use cyber forces like you would a navy. And kind of how often put it is you can't use a jet like a battleship. And so you can't use malware like infantry. And this begins to move into my space, which is about doctrine. So if you have a piece of malware, some form of capability, how you use or deploy it is ultimately based off of how you understand its use. All right. So quick comment on what is doctrine in the first place. You'll see a lot of different explanations and definitions of what it is. I know many people will largely be familiar with it as military doctrine, and that's probably where really most of the discussion is these days. But by and large, doctrine is much wider than this. And my favorite definition of it is that it's the visible expression of a belief system uh, that includes institutional, and this means institutional not in an actual organization, but rather as a community with some form of communal aspects to it. Like the Discord server we're on right now could be described as an institution. Doctrine is usually written. Uh, Reasons for this I'll get into a little bit later, but it's important that it's usually written because of ensuring consistency and spreading this information. As a big purpose of doctrine is to ensure whatever group you're in has a kind of unified belief to this. And this belief system usually already kind of exists in some manner. And so doctrine is really the formalized process of this belief system. And in many ways, it's can really just be described as what we think is the right way to do. And so I like to think that doctrine is kind of above tactics, techniques, and procedures. It what goes into informs that and is very much cultural in a way and uh, a little bit problematic to stay similar to norms in that they're kind of acceptable manners of behavior. But even then, this isn't always followed. And we'll cover that to some degree. So some examples here from military, some hit and run and shock and awe you may have heard are just general concepts, and the nitty gritty of that can be a little bit different. Fuzzing itself, I would maybe argue, is a form of doctrine in InfoSec. The actual process of doing that uh, can vary a little bit, but the process of uh, doing fuzzing produces results, and even today, various different philosophies about doing that. And to some degree, I would even say tabs versus spaces is a great way to understanding uh, that doctrine is kind of a all-encompassing uh, belief system, but isn't always something completely serious. And also here I show that while a lot of the doctrine talks about kind of on the tactical or operational level, a lot of it is on a strategic and political level. So how North Korea and Russia have operationalized ransomware to benefit the state, I think is a great example of this, where uh, both Russia and North Korea have used ransomware very differently. But if you look at North Korea, who have systematically incorporated into uh, their operations as a state, that it goes from just a tactic to rather a uh, state approach to achieving its aims, which is to earn money for their illegal programs. And uh, I'm not totally convinced on this one yet. This new one I added, which is the People's Republic of China mandates that all new vulnerabilities and ODAs found have to first be reported to the state. And this is drawing a lot of concerns from policy people like myself, which is that the China is essentially turning the entire uh, system that the InfoSec community has developed and reporting ODAs or fighting them and then fixing them. China is trying to change how the community, specifically in China, operates so that it services the state directly. And this itself, I think, goes beyond doctrine, but it's a good kind of way to paint on how this goes into the motivations for actions. And a big purpose of this doctrine is to ensure kind of that consistency that I mentioned. When you are uh, teaching new generations of people, uh, you'll have various classes, but each of these classes will have some kind of stream to them. They're all hoping to achieve some ends. And that's where the institutions part of this is quite important, that we can all share a level of belief systems together, but the institution is what kind of brings these together to try to formalize it. And that's why I argue it's critically important to understanding how states work globally and how that impacts cyber conflict. So I think here it shows kind of the tension that exists, that not only is kind of doctrine there to ensure that continuity, but you're also facing these various paradigm shifts that even 10 years ago, I'm not sure anyone would have predicted how central ransomware has become to us. Uh, and even though kind of in the West, states haven't incorporated it into the states and how they achieve their objectives. Uh, it ultimately affects how uh, Western countries react because they're constantly having to defend against them and target these groups, which can take away focusing on other efforts. And so I borrow from the Gruck's use of cybercraft as kind of a way to conceptualize what doctrine is in cyber. And so, as when we think of cyber operations, a lot of our view goes to kind of Stuxnet and these highly targeted operations. But really, how this occurs is complex. That's how these groups and APTs will accomplish their objectives. Will often involve information operations, as an argument could easily be made that phishing is a form of information operation. And I think that's why cybercraft is, as a concept, is important because it broadens our understanding of what using cyberspace as kind of a tool of the state to achieve its ends. That it's not going to occur along predictable lines, but as long as it is connected to cyberspace in some way, it can be affected. And so me saying this to all of you may be quite obvious, but believe it or not, it comes as a surprise to many social scientists. So my favorite part of cybercraft is that it kind of emphasizes that to operate is a practice. And part of this practice is formalized by the state into doctrine. And this practice of doing cyber, which, as ridiculous as that sounds, is really kind of the central concept to this. Right. And so now that we've kind of covered the basic levels of doctrine, let's start looking at the cool and interesting stuff and apply it to Russia and their invasion of Ukraine. So if we look at how Russia organizes their cyber force structures, we see it's isolated to three primary groups. And so force structures is really just a fancy way militaries refer to, or in states refer to, uh, organizations for the explicit purpose of doing something. And so the language that they'll use is usually to project force in some way, where for an army, that can usually mean bullets, for cyber, malware, or even information operations. So, in looking at this structure, which is this charts from NATO, uh, the military's cyber operations are largely isolated to the GRU, which is the General Staff of the Armed Forces. So, kind of understanding this, we can maybe make the educated guess that if Russia was to invade somewhere, the GRU would likely take the lead on this because they're the ones interacting with the military all day, every day. That their interaction with the rest of the military will be a lot more seamless than, say, if the FSB did it. That's not to say that the FSB won't be involved in such invasions, and both the GRU and FSB were in the invasion of Ukraine. But much of it is about how the military organizes itself. And even in the West, what we'll refer to as uh, dividing up responsibilities and authorities, the same thing goes into this kind of thinking. So now that we know and understand that the GRU would likely be the ones that would take the lead in Ukraine, uh, we can take a step back to try and understand what would they likely target, what is their doctrine or a pattern of behavior that goes into this. So just a cursory look at what they have done before. Let's take a look. So here are just 3 different articles. The top right one is from the Congressional Research Service, and it's a pretty good paper as well. But all of these kind of illustrates that the GRU really likes to target transportation systems, really likes to target online banking and media, and they have extensively targeted Ukrainian electrical systems too. So just based off of this, we can understand that they're likely going to target transportation systems. Makes sense. Going to invade a country, you don't want people to move easily. Likely to target electrical systems to take that up to deny your enemy electricity, and to target banks to deny people the use of their money. So as much as we can kind of look back on this now, this is exactly the type of thinking that went into prior to the invasion. This is exactly the kind of really guesstimation that goes into this. While the military will have additional sources, this type of OSINT is really forms the basis of a lot of defense intelligence that militaries and defense departments will usually have some sort of intelligence arm to it, but it's not like the CIA or other intelligence organizations. A good bulk of what they do will be simply OSINTs and kind of understanding open movements of military. And so even though this type of OSINT understanding procedures of APTs isn't exactly watching movements of military equipment, it's still exactly the same kind of process to understand APTs. And so in looking at kind of the first initial months, we know that Russia was specifically seeking Ukraine to become a puppet state and to be either neutral or hostile to NATO and the EU. And principally that Russia sought a quick victory over Ukraine with overwhelming force. And so based off of this, and understanding the existing doctrine that kind of exists, it proceeded exactly as we would expected. They targeted transportation systems, chiefly to prevent people from leaving the country, as they wanted Ukrainians to stay to be used as hostages. The ransomware and intimidation tactics prior to it kind of still went into this as well, to intimidate Ukraine to capitulate and to not resist as much, and targeted banks and the general infrastructure on the eve or days preceding, because they didn't want Ukraine to be able to operate even as a society in order to break down their ability to respond. And that would ultimately, in the hope of Russia, make it easier for them to establish a puppet state. So in this sense, we start to understand the greater importance of cyber conflict, that not only is it to be used take down military equipment, but it's achieving larger political aims. And a really important one, I think, is to look at the Viasat hack, which got a lot of headlines. It was the day of the invasion. All of a sudden, some Viasat communication modems started going offline. And it wasn't until others found, I believe it was some windmills began to not communicate either, that we analysts started to understand what was going on. So what Russia had done here was to target Viasat modems, which were used by the Ukrainian military for communication. And this is quite important because it occurred right at the invasion, the initial invasion, when Russian special forces penetrated deep into Ukraine near the capital. And I should also mention that all of these were wipers deployed against Ukraine. And I think it may have been Google that referred to 2022 as the year of the wiper, because more wipers have been deployed against Ukraine than I think have ever existed prior to the invasion. So even if we kind of accept Rid's point that cyber war isn't exactly a thing, we see that there is a specific tactic being developed and used in an environment where it traditionally isn't used. As what criminal would want to destroy the data rather than uh, extract it and try to earn some money? So there are distinct differences in how criminal groups and APTs will operate, and kind of understanding this allows people to kind of be a bit more flexible in responding to these threats do arise. And the Viasat hack is particularly important because you'll often hear about people that say, okay, cyber is there, but it's not important operationally or tactically. But I would just refer to this hack, which was pivotal in the initial phases of the war. And so, provided a short video here, I think that really encapsulates it well about why Russia's efforts weren't that successful. Okay, I was worried about that, but I'll just skip that for now. The main point of it is that the initial opening phases, Russia sent special forces by helicopter from Belarus into the outskirts of Kyiv, where there's the Anatov airport. And this was done alongside jamming the Viasat communications that at the beginning of the war, Ukrainian generals said that it had a major impact, but later on would walk it back. And we would understand why he would later on walk it back, because it apparently had a major effect on their operations. That it wasn't Ukraine's ability to respond with their own technical or highly technical fighting ability. That Ukraine are quite adept in their own right, but it's been their flexibility against these cyber threats that have been able to allow them to adapt. So uh, many people try and cite or say that Ukraine as a low tech force, but that really isn't the case if we just look at the vast use of drones. And that's the use of these drones kind of and the electrical uh, warfare components that tie into this are very much wrapped up with each other, kind of understanding the technical environment that exists. That it's not just a fire and forget system, but you need to understand how to use it to achieve one's objectives. And so, in the end, although an argument could be made that Russia's most successful components of the war were its cyber attacks, but they ultimately came up short for a few reasons. Broadly speaking, there were both very targeted hacks, like the Viasat one, which, although it had some spillover to other parts of Europe, which is what uh, worried Russia, as they didn't want it to uh, get them additional attention from cybercom and the like. So, although they were very targeted attacks, a lot of the other attacks have been described as kind of very rushed relying upon already known vulnerabilities or exploits, and kind of hoping for Ukrainian ignorance or overlooking some kind of issue. So since then, it's been a lot of uh, scrambling to try and respond and get some type of results because of the overall failures of the Russian side of the war. As bad logistics isn't going to only affect the physical components, as it's starting to becoming clear that it's also affecting the cyber operations to a degree. And it was much of the kind of lead up to the war as well that influenced a lot of this. The war for Ukraine has been going on since 2013, 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea. They've been under constant attack from Russia since then, which has allowed them to uh, focus on their defenses a lot, and they have gotten a lot of support from NATO for this, which I'll actually move to the next slide on this. Yeah, as mentioned, Ukraine has been preparing for this for a decade. That they've had United States and NATO leading hunt forward operations to help with uh, the defense of these systems. And so Hunt Forward is a concept developed by the United States that other countries are jumping in on, including Canada, surprisingly, which is more or less sending cybersecurity experts to a place in order to assist, to gather intelligence on what's being used, and also to help defend the systems. And this is what Ukraine and with NATO has been doing for almost a decade at least. And there was also a major surge of doing this kind of right before the initial invasion as well. That Google found there's a major influx of phishing right before that, and we can only assume that U.S. and allies kind of understood this, and it's within this area that they sent a lot more teams to help defend the country. And this is also why we didn't see any major attacks on electrical systems. That why the kind of the motivation behind this is, why would you waste a exploit to maybe cut off the electrical system when a cruise missile would do just as fine? And this is kind of the reality of understanding that cyber doesn't exist in a vacuum, that how it interrelates with real world events is quite important to understanding how it will ultimately affect any sort of threat model. And kind of understanding how kind of desperation then comes into play, as it increases the possibility of error and escalation of the conflict. And that is part of where kind of NATO is now with cyber operations. That as we saw a major rise of them early in the war, and themes have, although been consistent, but uh, reduced to some level, there's greater concern that there might be another biosat to occur that may escalate things further. That's ultimately the kind of the thinking that goes into this. It's kind of, so from all of this that occurs, we can see a few lessons learned, which is even though some really major cyber attacks did occur, as soon as tanks were rolling over Ukraine's border, people's concern about cyber attacks goes rock bottom. So even though a lot of attacks were occurring, people will almost assume that it's not going on because it's just not getting coverage, and can blame the media for this, or just simply there's so much to take in. But it's ultimately people's misperception is going to have some sort of factor on this, which is why information operations are increasingly becoming more and more important, not as a way of modifying the information or misinformation, but ensuring the right message gets out. And I say right message and not correct, because I would recommend looking at how Ukraine has deployed their information operations to an astounding effect. As if you look at the was around the Ghost of Kiev, where it's that lone pilot that took down, I don't know how many MiGs that he was attributed to, but ultimately came out that it wasn't real. And uh, Ukraine has no issue kind of leaning into these type of uh, misinformation if it is beneficial to the state. But kind of the important takeaway from this, I'll say time and time again, is that it's all messy. That's how this will kind of influence both Russia's role in this and how it affects uh, organizations globally is changes on a day-to-day basis. So it's not something all organizations are really able to uh, effectively pay attention to, but it highlights the importance of kind of redundancy, or at least paying attention to global politics for risk of spillover, such as the Viasat hack. Uh, and ultimately, the so what is that it's the language of doctrine helps us to begin to understand that tactics, techniques, and procedures don't exist in a vacuum. That different communities develop to understand and learn how to hack and how to write malware. As if you look at kind of the Indian hack for hire scene versus the North American black hat scene are totally different, and kind of the common approaches and techniques that are used will be radically different. And doctrine and understanding kind of the cultural aspects of these processes is the main point that I'm looking to get across. And that doctrine is ultimately scales the process. So the challenge in the end is that additional research is needed. That I'm still relatively at the beginning of this research. That there's still a lot to look at China uh, and Russia to some degree, but I think most of the way done with Russia. I'm not sure of the applicability of this to non-state groups and criminal groups. The more they're institutional and are more organized, there's a greater likelihood of this affecting the how they operate. And just like norms, doctrine is not always followed. Uh, what the best way to understand doctrine is that it's a how we understand is the best way to approach a problem. But the best way to approach a problem is not always the exact same. And so, innovation and uh, lateral movements across methods is kind of the point of that tension that I mentioned. That although doctrine tries to formalize a process, those that maintain it are always looking at kind of maintaining a consistency of what works versus pushing at what assumptions may be there about what they're doing. And ultimately, in the end, about kind of this approach of doctrine and force structures is that attribution matters, and understanding what groups are doing what allows you to impose costs on them and for states to respond. What this means for organizations isn't as much important, but the important part for organizations and businesses is the attributions allows you to understand what types of groups may want to target you, and doctrine allows you to be flexible in how to respond to this. That if you may be part of an organization that is critical infrastructure, you may begin to look at the GRU and others that like to hack uh, critical infrastructure. All right, and with that, open floor to questions. Happy to talk about anything, uh, including any clarifying points you may want on this, but happy to talk about anything role plays related. Thanks. Okay, okay, thanks. Uh, so one thing I'd like to get across to social scientists is in international relations, or I think political science generally, is that there's a concept called a monopoly on violence, and it refers to kind of the authority that we give a state to do violence on our behalf. So uh, police and the military, we give our respective countries the authority to do these things because it's what goes into being a country. But in cyberspace, this doesn't hold up as much, and it's what I refer to as that states don't have a monopoly on violence. That uh, individuals have the exact same potential to do harm in cyberspace as states do. But where states have the advantage is that scale. So that scale of being able to bring in a lot more resources uh, and a lot more potential to have an array of maybe different exploits or malware, and even having um, additional intelligence on that go into just scouting a system. So that is kind of where you see that differential existing. And so, but where you kind of get the uh, kind of the advantage that individuals have is that my point about a $10 exploit is as good as a 100 billion. That's ultimately how you use it to that makes that greatest effects. That ransomware has completely altered how the industry and individuals operates, not only on kind of the defensive side, but also offensive. Yeah, that's at least part of the process. Where you can kind of look at what a group has used. That you can look at kind of the granular part of just the APT specifically, or kind of the larger group. And that's for me, I try to look at the larger kind of group, so the GRU broadly, and that's what are the important things for the GRU to attack in the event of a conflict. And if you look at back on just what they have targeted, it gives you at least some level of insight of what they could target uh, in the future. So even though it may not get you kind of hyper specific, it allows you some flexibility to kind of steer the framing of what you should you be concerned about. So if you are not in critical infrastructure or corresponding areas, likely don't have much to worry about. But it's that rare instance like Viasat where we only found out about it once other parts of Europe were hit. That's kind of understanding uh, how you could be affected and need for redundancy comes in. It's I would probably be there with you. Like even though pay attention pretty well, it's I don't know if it's alter things too much. That part of where the field is right now is kind of going into hyperspecificity. And I think part of that is the greater influence of information security kind of on academics. So you have like Dmitry Alterovich, Danny Moore, Max Meets. That's although yeah, Danny Moore is a technical operator. Like all of these people have at least some level of basis or bringing in information security in some manner. So I think perhaps one of the bigger aspects I think motivated by Ukraine's invasion as well is that the there's a lot more understanding and awareness of the technical side of it as in I remember in 2009 arguing against people on RIDS points even then, but it's taken almost a decade to even get to the point we are now, and people aren't obsessing as much. That understanding that maybe things are a bit more complex than we gave them out to be. Yeah, it's mm, yeah, I would even be in the camp that to say that it doesn't exist, but for me, the argument negates it in the first place. That's the only real way to win is not to debate it in the first place, as at that point you're debating not the content of what cyber conflict is, but debating it on semantics. Thank you for the invitation. Just say I am doing a lot of research on Canadian cyber defense. I have a Linktree uh, QR code there if you want to follow my work. Outside of that, I'm Alex F. Rudolph on most socials. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions.